title of my paper, as you can see, is The Shortfall in the Ptolemaic Revenues, Economic Policy as a Political Necessity. So, the Ptolemaic period in Egypt was, in many respects, an informal continuation of the Sate and Persian systems of governance. However, there was a primary political difference between the Ptolemaic and the preceding Sate and Persian systems. In contrast to the previous satrap system of tribute, the Ptolemies re-established a centralized pharaonic-style dynasty to legitimize their rule over Egypt as their homeland. The economic centralization of Ptolemaic Egypt, however, owed much to the Sate and Persian periods. The Ptolemies largely adopted the Persian tributary economy, with a few significant alterations to the economic system. The main changes implemented during the Ptolemaic period were economic intensification and monetization. During the initial period under Ptolemy I Soter and Ptolemy II Philadelphus, the economy saw an intensification in agrarian production, royal banks, and royal granaries. The foundation of new urban centers and the reclamation of new arable land in the Fayum region indicate that the early Ptolemaic period under the first two Ptolemies experienced aggregate economic growth. Further, the increased farming of wheat, which would have initially resulted from the land reclamation, at least in some regions, would have resulted in an increase in agricultural productivity. However, where the Persians had utilized as light a hand as possible in terms of taxation and rent to keep the local populations peaceable during their rule, Ptolemies sought to maximize royal revenues and tie important constituent groups to their regime to gain legitimacy. Whether the Ptolemaic attempt was successful initially or in the end is a different story. In this paper, I will argue that the Ptolemaic regime sought political legitimacy by altering an inherited tributary system regarding land tenure, taxation, and agricultural production. These modifications may have led to a decrease in royal revenue, but they were crucial in legitimizing the Ptolemaic regime. In the first section, I will define the measurements and terms used in the relevant documents. Also, if you look on your handouts, many of these terms have been defined for ease of use throughout the paper. In the second section, I will examine the formation of rent, land taxes, and land tenures in Ptolemaic Egypt and how they led to a decrease in revenues. In the third section, I will examine the system of taxation and collection, as well as the increased bureaucracy found in the early Ptolemaic reign and how this diminished the royal revenue. In the fourth section, I will examine grain production and land use in Ptolemaic Egypt and how this led to decreased productivity. Finally, in conclusion, I will argue that all the decreases in royal revenues were the result of necessary political changes to legitimize the Ptolemaic regime. So first we have the classification of measures and terms. The vast majority of information about the Ptolemaic period economy is derived from documents related to taxation. As such, much of the terminology of the documents is rather unfamiliar. The aurora was the most commonly used measurement of land in Ptolemaic Egypt. It had a side width length of 52.5 meters. The aurora was generally measured in units of square. As such, one aurora equates to 2,756 square meters, or 1 square kilometer is thus equivalent to 363 auroras. The arba was the most commonly used measurement of volume and weight, specifically for measures of grain and agricultural produce. One Ptolemaic arba is equivalent to 38.808 liters. Because the arba was primarily used to measure grain, the weight of one arba of wheat, equivalent to 30.2 kilograms, was also commonly used as a reference for an arba in general. So, the majority of arba and analysis of receipts refer to an equivalent measure in the value of grain. The drachma is a common unit of currency which had a Ptolemaic specific standard. This Ptolemaic currency was first minted during the reign of Ptolemy II Philadelphus. The heavy Athenian weight standard was commonly used until Ptolemy I Soter abandoned it in favor of a lighter Phoenician drachma. The weight of one Ptolemaic silver drachma, equivalent to 6 obols, appears to have stayed relatively stable throughout Ptolemaic rule, weighing approximately 3.55 metric grams of silver. Further, the documents outline various positions within the Ptolemaic system of governance. For example, the Ptolemaic Egyptian introduced a military composed of nearly entirely mercenaries. These soldiers were then settled on the land, which tied the military to the Ptolemies, or at least that was the hope. The mercenary settlers are called clerics. In terms of economic and civil administration, Ptolemaic Egypt was divided into 3 levels of governance: the village, komai, district, topoi, and the province, nomai. Each of these distinct tiers had a different official administrator associated with them to enforce Ptolemaic rule, the comarch, toparch, and nomarch respectively. Each of these administrators answered to the dioikites, who was the financial administrator of the entire Ptolemaic kingdom. The dioikites would also employ oikonomoi, or oikonomos, an administrator who would travel between the three tiers of governance to ensure that each was performing its economic duties. Now that the basic groundwork of what these terms actually mean is sort of out of the way, we move on to a little bit more substance, namely the rents, land taxes, and land tenure. So this section essentially focuses mainly on the land as it is used by the Ptolemies. So the rents and land tenures were central to the Ptolemaic economy and made up much of the annual ruling wealth. There were several taxes and rental fees associated with either leasing land or acquiring private property, which, if you were not a soldier, was a costly endeavor. There was a principal tax on all grain-bearing land, which was collected in kind if the land you were cultivating produced grain. There were also taxes on the land itself, namely an additional flat tax called the plebeian, which was assessed on the size of the plot and the condition of the soil. In Ptolemaic Egypt, there were four central groupings of land holdings: the royal land, clerical estates and gift estates, private land holdings, and the temple lands. Depending on the region of Egypt, the proportions of land ownership varied drastically. Recently analyzed evidence confirms the widespread private holding of land in the south of Egypt during the Ptolemaic period. Private lands were not only a large initial investment, but also a longer-term investment, as taxation on private lands appears to have been near comparable to the royal land in the Fayum, another region in the north of Egypt. However, in their attempt to re-establish the Pharaonic dynasty, the Ptolemies were forced to uphold such political structures which were derived from Pharaonic periods in Egypt's history, such as in the south of Egypt, where heavy, densely populated areas had been long settled. Ptolemies continued, therefore, to preserve and even increase the estates of peoples and temples located in Upper and Middle Egypt, removed from themselves. Thus, the temples of Upper and Middle Egypt controlled a significant portion of the total arable land. For example, the Temple of Horus Edfu, a single temple in the nome of Edfu, reported a total land holding of 13,209 euros, of which 9,181 were in the Edfu nome, a province in the Plebeian. This represents approximately 16 to 18% of the total fertile land located in the entire nome in this period. Thus, in areas of long-term dense population, where pharaonic institutions remained and the strength of the temples was more powerful than in newly established areas, the temples were able to control greater and greater amounts of land. Accordingly, in Lower Egypt, there is much less continuity in the strength of temples, as the areas had been historically less densely populated. Nevertheless, the creation of two new urban centers, Alexandria and Ptolemais, and the reclamation of new arable land in the Fayum led to an increase in population. In these areas, specifically the Fayum, the Ptolemies attempted to maintain the control of this land for economic purposes. Rather than empowering temples to organize the cultivation of the newly reclaimed land, Ptolemy I Soter and Ptolemy II Philadelphus turned to Greek estate managers and clerics as parts of a growing bureaucracy. With the creation of massive gift estates, or dorea, a practice which was common in the Sate and Persian periods of occupation, this enabled the Ptolemies to develop vast tracts of newly reclaimed land in the Fayum without initial economic investment on their part. Gift estates were essentially large parcels of land which the Ptolemies gave to powerful and wealthy bureaucrats to ameliorate the formerly wasteland in order to benefit the Ptolemies later on. While such estates created new streams of income for the Ptolemies, which were to revert to royal land after the tenure of the managers and could thus be later rented once reclaimed, much of the incentive for productivity was left to the managers. Thus, the focus for the managers was not on ensuring the stable extraction of wealth or the amelioration of the land in the long term, but on maximizing the wealth extracted for the managers themselves during their tenures. Further, such large gift estates as the 10,000 aurora estate of Apollonius were often experimental and had areas of cultivation which failed, resulting in crop produce reductions and loss of capital. Finally, the onus of tax collection was left to the estate managers, creating another level of administration and therefore another level for corruption on these gift estates. For example, a letter dated to 256 BC from the foreman of a group of stonecutters argues they were being wronged by the same Apollonius, who also happened to be the Dioikites. Apollonius has set us to work on the hard stone, not dividing it between us and the others, while he has assigned his own men the soft stone. As it is, we are being ruined by wearing out the edges of our tools. We beg you, so that we may obtain our rates, to measure out how much extra hard stone we have cut, so that it may be imposed in addition to the 140 quartermen, and we may not be oppressed. This document is important as the amount of stone you actually quarried was the important part, not how difficult the stone was. So the softer stone made it so that these groups could actually profit more. As they were the workmen of Apollonius, Apollonius himself profited more. The self-interest of the administration led to corruption, as they preferred their own workers or land to maximize their profits, not the long-term effects that this would have on the economy. In the newly reclaimed land, such as the Fayum, the Ptolemies attempted to tie the clerics' loyalty to themselves by giving estates for military service. This policy led to a sizable portion of the total arable land being controlled by clerics. The clerics were divided into three categories of land tenure, dependent on their service in the military. Cavalry acquired approximately 100 aurora estates, and the infantry acquired either 25 or 30 aurora estates. From the remaining evidence, it appears that the number of cavalry soldiers settled in the Fayum was much higher relative to infantry. Clarice and Thompson supposed from documentary evidence that there were approximately 1,068 cavalry settlers in the Fayum. Further, Clarice and Thompson argue that if each of them were to acquire the 100 aurora estates they were supposed to, they would possess approximately 106,800 auroras. With the information that the likely number of infantry soldiers was less than that of the cavalry, along with the lower likely estate size, they posit that the infantry estates could hardly account for more than 10 to 30,000 auroras. This means that with a probable total arable land amount of the Fayum of 1,350 kilometers square, or 371,000 auroras, almost 1/3 of all of the arable land in the Fayum was clerical land. Analysis of land tenure documents from Kirk Osiris, a village in the Fayum, appear to corroborate the argument given by Clarice and Thompson, with clerical land around 34% and royal land totaling around 52%. This sample indicates that in such rural areas as the Fayum, which had been newly redeveloped, in which the early Ptolemies promoted economic stimulus by improving infrastructure, clerical land totaled around 2/6 of the land, almost 4/6 was royal land, and less than 1/6, less than 16%, as temple lands. This is to be contrasted with the south of Egypt, which at that time, a single temple in the Infidome had 16% of the entire landmass on its own. For the temples to have less than 16% in combination in the entirety of the Fayum is an extremely low number when in comparison. The importance for the Ptolemaic royal treasury in maintaining such agricultural land was extremely high, mainly due to the rents and the fees levied against them. The total tax burden on royal land, including various small fees for grain transportation and repayment of the seed loans given by the royal treasuries, approached half of the land's annual production. For comparison, in the same period, the rents for land were assessed as a percentage of the yield on the land, and the average was around 1/3 of the annual production. Thus, there was a drastic increase in the rent and tax on land during the Ptolemaic period. Further, documents dating to the 3rd century BC in Ptolemaic Egypt generally suggest that it was more common to lease than to purchase land. Even in new lands, such as in the Fayum, where clerics were given plots of land, the Greek preference for urban living often prompted them to lease their lands. This preference to lease likely created a disincentive to develop the land beyond the necessary level, as one could only hope to rent for as much as the cheapest royal land lease, which likely led to suboptimal productivity on any leased lands. The Ptolemies made attempts to influence the leasing of lands which owners did not wish to cultivate themselves. Namely, there was a flat tax levied on all clerical and temple land outside of the plebeian collected on grain. The tax, which was known as the artabeia, was assessed at the rate of 1/2, 1, or 2 artabas of grain per aurora, and the tax was required whether the land was cultivated or not. Therefore, it incentivized the leasing of the land to avoid a deficit. As the better the productivity of the soil, the higher the tax, regardless of whether you got grain from it or not. This was a sizable portion of the produce from a piece of land, so failing to lease could be costly. For a contextual point, as to the amount of the tax, a document from Pharaonic Egypt discusses the assessed value of land, stating that each aurora of a slightly smaller size, around 2,741 meters square, would produce around 5 car of grain. Car equals around 34 kilograms, meaning a total agricultural product weight of 170 kilograms of grain produced per aurora. This weight would equate to about 5.6 artabas. This means that depending on the value of the assessed land, the clerical estate or temple estate would have to pay a flat tax at either 10%, 18%, or 36% of the total grain possible to produce per aurora. Indeed, the taxes imposed on military peasants of all groups were sometimes so heavy, and the land which they had been given being no more than reclaimed wasteland, that they could be forced to give up their allotments shortly after acquiring them if they did not work them properly. Now on to individual taxes, tax collection, and the bureaucracy. The Ptolemies inherited a tributary economic system in which, in theory, the state was the household, or the oikos, of the king. In administration of the Ptolemaic monarchy, the bureaucracy managed the various levels of governance more and more over time. With the increased size of arable land, new rural settlements, and the new urban centers in the 3rd century BCE, came in ever-expanding system of liturgies, with which to ensure the receipt of state revenues. Thus, keeping the state as the household of the king required a growing administration, which had to be paid for mainly with tax revenue. The main tax of the Ptolemaic economy was the salt tax, which is first documented in the 22nd year of Ptolemy II Philadelphus. The Ptolemaic salt tax functioned as a poll tax, which was made possible by a shift from labor tax, a common practice of taxing physical labor, maintaining the irrigation systems, to a monetary tax, where the clear majority was paid in the newly fabricated Ptolemaic coinage. Evidence indicates that the tax was an innovation of this period and may have replaced the pre-existing young tax, a capitation tax only on males. What is significant about the salt tax is that it is a capitation tax or head tax on both males and females, but at different rates. There were two important factors which made such a head tax feasible. First, the monetization of the economic system, which allowed for a more readily set, more easily transportable form of taxation. And second, the intimate tie to the census record. In the initial stages of this tax, there were very few exemptions to the tax. All adults, both male and female, were liable to the tax. Census records show that beyond just humans, any livestock associated with the household was also liable for taxation. Both humans and animals needed salt, and the Ptolemies made sure to tax them both for the product. The rates at which the salt tax were levied decreased over time. As you can see on the handout, you should have a chart with the differing tax rates. From papyrological evidence, we see 3 distinct rate phases of the salt tax during the 3rd century BCE. In the initial stage, rate A, the rate is 1 drachma 3 obols for males and 1 drachma for females. In the second stage, rate B, the rate drops from 1 drachma for males and 3 obols for females. In the third and final stage, with documented evidence, it drops to its lowest documented amount before it eventually ceases to exist at 4 obols, in actuality 3, but an obolus had been added to it, and for females 1.5 obols. We can see that in rate A, the females are taxed at 2/3 the rate of males, but for all subsequent rates, they are taxed at 1/2 their male counterparts. A likely cause for the diminishing salt tax rate is the increasing difficulty on the part of the crown in collecting these taxes. On an average daily wage of an obol, 1.5 drachmas, which is equivalent to 9 obols, as the annual A rate for males, represents over a week of work for the individual. With the addition of the female 6 obols, if the person is married, a total of 15 obols is reached. This is not including any children or any animals thereafter, which 15 obols may represent the wages of half a working month. As the economy centered around agriculture and the annual flooding, the average peasant likely did not work for the full year, but only during the on-seasons, with partial work on infrastructure during the non-agricultural seasons. To ensure that taxes could be paid, or would be paid, without reducing the population to destitution, an attempt was made to allow the collection of salt tax incrementally over a period of 6 months. And firstly, this decision created more time during which such taxes could fall through the metaphorical cracks, if not closely regulated. Along with the decreasing rates, there was an equivalent increase in the number of exemptions. For example, during the B rate, the decrease to 1 drachma is evident only in certain portions of the population for the first decade that it is implemented, mainly the clerus and those who acquire the tax title of Hellenes. The title of Hellenes was not, however, tied to ethnicity, but was rather an indication of importance in the Ptolemaic state, and was mainly reserved for administrative positions. Such exemptions, over time, with decreases in certain taxes, and evidence for others being completely omitted, was likely a means of creating loyalty to the Ptolemies within these groups. During the 3rd century BC, we see the emergence of a 2-part system of tax collection centered around the tax collectors, logeotes, and of tax farmers, Plebs. The actual division of labor between the two was never formally codified, but the distinction between the two was based upon wealth. The tax collector had the task of collecting the taxes imposed upon them by the state due to their wealth as a service to the Ptolemies. This is known as a liturgical system of tax collection. Then an auction would usually occur in which tax farmers would bid for the ability to assist in the collecting of taxes and be paid for their services. However, whatever shortfall should arise in the process of collecting taxes was to be paid by the tax collector themselves. With the creation of tax farmers, the state was guaranteed the payment of a fixed sum of money, and so the ability to balance its budget. The issue with such a system of tax collection, where the collector is neither directly funded by the state nor monitored in the collection process, is that they tend to be either too heavy-handed or too light-handed in their collection. For example, papyrological document of a letter with instructions from the Dioikites to an oikonomos written in the late 3rd century BC specifically discusses the matter of embezzlement or theft of wealth from the people. Take particular care that no peculation or any other wrong takes place, for every resident in the country must clearly understand and believe that all acts of this kind have been stopped, and that they are freed from the bad conditions of the past. As you can see, peculation or the embezzling of funds and wealth is specifically discussed as an important duty to cease this action. However, as the liturgical system was placed upon the wealthiest in a region, any shortfall could be extremely detrimental. A record of tax collection from Heraclides, a tax region in Ptolemaic, somewhere between 243 and 217 BCE, indicates the extent to which shortfall could occur. By the end of the 6-month tax period, the tax collectors from the region had only collected around 53.6% of the total tax. This means that 46 or so percent, roughly half of the entire tax which was to be collected, had to be paid out by the tax collectors themselves, with specific amounts and collectors identified on the verso of the document. While some of the sums were paid, more were written off for those tax collectors who had fled the area, those no longer alive, those unable to pay, or for a tax fugitive already under arrest. In such a case, not only did those liable to the liturgy attempt to avoid being the tax collector, to avert possible detriment to themselves, but there was also a drain on the royal treasury. The Ptolemaic economic system and the monetization of it were centered around the collection of taxes, whether they be land taxes or individual taxes. While actual collection rates are unrecorded, surviving evidence indicates that the in-payment rates to the royal banks were low. With each level of bureaucracy, further possibilities for corruption arose and caused a drain on the royal economy. For example, there is a petition sent to the Dioikites in 151 BC pertaining to a comarch's extortion. I have fled to you to receive help, for in the 27th year, when I had been appointed as decanos of the royal cultivators in the village, and he made a substantial paralogia, or an unauthorized extra collection, each year from the same cultivators of 1/2 an arba of wheat per aurora and 90 drachmas of bronze, from which he was amassing it to be stolen. During this period, 90 drachmas of bronze is roughly equivalent to just over 1/3 of an arba of wheat, so the total extorted value was approximately 5/6 of an arba of wheat per aurora, a substantial portion of the annual crop, around 1/10, alongside the other half that was already being removed. The increasing number of tax exemptions, decreasing rate of tax collection, and increasingly corruptible bureaucracy managing the whole affair led inevitably to a decrease in the total royal revenue during the 3rd century BC Ptolemaic Egypt. The main crops in grain production in ancient pre-Ptolemaic Egypt were barley, which was sown on drier land, and amaranth flax, which were sown on the wettest land. Grain crops took up about half of the available fields and produced 1 crop per year. The fertility of the soil allowed grain to be planted in the basins 2 out of 5 years on average. Theoretically, if allowing for a rotation of the agricultural production of fields, the soils would have replenished nutrient levels after 3 years of usage for pasturage, or being left fallow. However, any higher level of agricultural intensification beyond this level would eventually lead to drastic reduction in soil nutrient levels, decreasing production rates. In the initial period of Ptolemaic rule, during the reign of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, there is the evidence for the introduction of a sowing schedule, the means of delineating what percentage of the arable land was to be used for agricultural produce. The introduction of this document has been argued to be a means to create a more reliable projection for the grain produced in any one year, by which the Ptolemies could balance their expenditures for that following year. Determining the revenue of grain rents owed to the king was likely the main purpose of the sowing schedule, the registering of land, and the census. This is because the grain rents were set prior to the agricultural year, based on the estimated production value of the land. Whatever the case may be, it was central to the Ptolemaic royal economy during the 3rd century BC. Prior to the growing season each year, it was possible to gauge the inundation level of the Nile and estimate the level of nutrient enrichment, and therefore the quality of the soil for crop production, allowing the bureaucracy to compile the sowing schedule. During the 3rd century BC, though, we see a drastic intensification in the production of grain as a percentage of the total usable land. Documents of the census and sowing schedule found for the Arsinoe node, which contains the fire, indicate that in 235 BC, Out of all the arable land used for cultivation, 90% or so was used for some form, generally wheat at 74%. That is not to say that 90% of all arable land was used for grain, but that 90% of all the arable land which was cultivated was used for grain. These percentages appear to be rather steady, as documents of the rents by crops on royal lands in the Hermopolite known for the 2nd century BC show similar rates, with 88% being dedicated to grain production. Further analysis of rent categories in Ptolemaic, a town in the Arsinoe known, outlined the total arable land located there and what it was used for. In the receipt of rent categories, a total of 2,000 aruras of arable land, approximately 6 square kilometers, were demarcated as crown land for rent. Of that 2,000 or so, only 300 were rented for pasturage. That means that approximately 1,800, give or take, were used for cultivation, and would thus be subject to the sowing schedule. If the categorization of the village of Tani holds as a sample of Ptolemaic crown land constitution, then it appears that approximately 85% of all crown lands were used for cultivation, and therefore 76%, 1.5 times higher than the amount found during the pre-Ptolemaic periods, were used for grain production. This degree of intensification of grain would have strained the soil's nutrient levels beyond the point that could be replenished by the alluvial flooding of the Nile. Such a schedule appears to have been solely implemented for royal land in Egypt. Attempts to control the maneuver Nile floods to maintain such high levels of alluvial nutrient enrichment led, in some cases, to adverse effects on soil nutrients. In the late 2nd century, Kirk-Osiris, a town in the Fayum, over 35% of the royal land in the town, which had previously been reclaimed, fell out of cultivation due to salinization or insufficient drainage. Due to the lack of incentive for landholders to ameliorate lands that were little more than desolate wasteland prior to, there was little to no increase in the productivity of the land overall. Further, little technological initiative was taken in the fields of agriculture. Those advancements that did exist were employed only sparsely, so there was little increase in agricultural productivity from this source. With the overproduction of nutrient-depleting crops, such as grains, and little incentive to increase the productivity of the land, agricultural output inevitably decreased from its initial high during the reigns of the first 2 Ptolemies. The Ptolemaic attempt to re-establish a pharaonic style of dynasty forced them to maintain an old land tenure regime in the Plebeian, where the right to convey land historically existed. The Ptolemies' desire to maximize revenues while minimizing expenditures led to the granting of land to important new constituents in the form of clerical estates and gift estates. Further, the desire to reduce payroll expenditures while maintaining a large tax economy necessitated the use of non-regulated agents to collect taxes based on a liturgical system, whereby the shortfall of collection fell upon the tax collector. However, all these factors in tandem inevitably led to a reduction in the state's revenue. The maintenance of private land and the increasing land tenure given to the long-standing temples in the Plebeian meant the crown land owned less. While increases to royal land were initially made from the reclamation of the fire and the building of new urban centers, it could not balance the non-royal land tenure in the Plebeian. In economies based on agricultural productivity and taxation of the land and produce, ownership of land is the principal basis of wealth and status. The establishment of clerical estates and gift estates to wealthy and important figures allowed for the structuring of newly reclaimed land in the Fayum and tied the loyalty of the mercenary troops to the land and the Ptolemies. However, the experimental nature of the gift estates and the urban lifestyle of mainly Greek clerus meant that there was an increasing trend developing in the 3rd century of land lease as opposed to land purchase. This trend caused a decrease in the agricultural productivity and a decrease in the wealth being directed to land improvement. Overproduction on deteriorating land inevitably led to its reversion to wasteland in originally man-made regions such as Kirk-Osiris. Finally, the use of liturgical systems of taxation and the increasing bureaucratic size to manage such taxation increased the wealth and standing of those in the Ptolemaic administration. The decreasing tax rates and the exemptions of taxes made to different groups of powerful constituents, such as the clerics, the temples, and the bureaucracy, ensured that they were tied to the interests of the Ptolemies. However, racketeering and a decrease in the ability of tax collectors to ensure the total collection led to a drain of Ptolemaic revenues. Funds intended for the royal banks were either expropriated midway through the process or were never collected at all. However, each of these decreases in the total revenues of the Ptolemies follow from the political necessity of seeking legitimacy for a new regime through the maintenance of old institutions, the creation of a pharaonic dynasty, and loyalty from the bureaucracy of the army. I realize that was a very long paper. Thank you all for sitting through it. If there are any questions, the floor is open. It's a little bit dense, so I can understand.